I get these types of questions a lot. Like, Kati, did my childhood trauma cause my BPD? Did my parents cause my BPD? And the most common, what causes BPD? Now, borderline personality disorder, otherwise known as BPD, is a mental illness that affects millions of people worldwide. It's characterized by a pattern of instability in moods, behavior, self-image, and relationships. Now, people with BPD may experience intense emotions, impulsive behavior, and difficulty in maintaining stable relationships. If you want a more in-depth look at what BPD is, I have a video about it that I'll link in the description. Research has shown that growing up in a chaotic or unstable environment can increase the risk for BPD. Now, this can include exposure to physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, neglect, abandonment, or even unstable and inconsistent parenting. Now, this type of environment can cause disruptions in the development of the brain's emotion regulation system, which you can imagine it would lead to difficulties in managing intense emotions, and in turn, lead to us having impulsive behaviors and other symptoms that we see in BPD. Additionally, growing up in a chaotic or unstable environment can lead to a difficulty in forming healthy attachments and relationships. A lack of a consistent, supportive, and nurturing environment during childhood may also lead to a lack of trust in oneself, in others, and in the world, or even in our own ability to cope with difficult emotions and situations, which can lead to difficulties in self-care, self-esteem, and self-worth. But when we talk about what causes mental illnesses, it's tricky because the truth is we don't know what causes mental illness. What we do know is that our brains are very complicated, and while specific experiences may not cause BPD, they could be risk factors that can trigger any tendencies that we already have for BPD. When it comes to mental health, it's important to understand the distinction between causes and risk factors. A cause is something that directly leads to the development of a condition, while a risk factor is something that increases the likelihood of a condition developing. For example, the cause of a broken bone is like a direct impact or force, such as falling, from a height or getting hit by a car. On the other hand, a risk factor for a broken bone includes things like osteoporosis, which makes the bones weaker and more likely to break. Similarly, in mental health, the causes of mental illness can be complex and multifaceted. It can include a combination of genetic, biological, environmental, and psychological factors. Risk factors, on the other hand, are conditions or circumstances that make a person more susceptible to developing a mental illness. And it's important to note that having one or more risk factors does not mean that a person will develop a mental illness. However, these factors may increase the likelihood of the development of the disorder. And newer research states that we can have a genetic predisposition for a mental illness, but we need a triggering event to turn on that gene. And they call this turning on portion epigenetics. And you can look into it more if you're interested. But I always thought that was really cool to know that we can have a genetic predisposition, but something still has to happen to turn on the gene. But overall, borderline personality disorder, or BPD, is a complex mental health condition that is thought to be caused by a combination of genetic, biological, environmental, and psychological factors. There are several risk factors that can increase the likelihood of developing BPD, and these include, Number one is the genetic component. Now, research has shown that there may be a genetic component to the disorder, as BPD tends to run in families, and we see it happening over and over, so we know it's there. And studies have found that first-degree relatives of individuals with BPD have a higher risk of developing the disorder themselves. Additionally, studies have shown that BPD has a heritability rate of about 30 to 40%, which means that genetics likely play a role in the development of the disorder. However, it's important to note that the exact genetic causes of BPD are not yet fully understood, and the research is ongoing. Additionally, genetic factors alone don't cause BPD. They're just one of several risk factors that can contribute to the development of the disorder. So let's move on to number 2, and that is biological. Now, research in this area is pretty new, but studies have found that individuals with BPD have changes in the structure and function of certain areas of their brain. And one area that has been found to be affected in BPD is the amygdala, which plays a key role in our stress response, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and in the processing of emotions, particularly fear and aggression. In individuals with BPD, the amygdala may be overactive. It could even be enlarged, leading to increased emotional reactivity and impulsivity. Another area that's been found to be affected in BPD is the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in decision-making, impulse control, and emotion regulation. And research has found that individuals with BPD may have a reduced activity in their prefrontal cortex, which could contribute to difficulties in regulating our emotions and impulsive behavior. And I've mentioned this before, but when we are pushed into our stress response and our amygdala is triggered, it sounds the alarm, pushing us into that fight flight. And when this is happening, when our amygdala is triggered and we're in fight flight, our prefrontal cortex goes offline. Because if you think about it, our brain is just trying to keep us alive, right? It thinks we're under threat, and we don't necessarily need to regulate our emotions or plan for the future. We need to survive. But when we have BPD, a lot of non-threatening situations can cause this to happen because we can be incredibly sensitive to what people say and do and worry that people are going to abandon us, which feels like a pretty big threat, right? So this can cause us to sometimes live in our stress response for most of our lives. Additionally, research has suggested that there may be abnormalities in the connection between different regions of the brain and BPD, specifically in the connections between the amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, and the hippocampus, a brain area involved in memory and emotion regulation. But as I said, the research is ongoing and still pretty new. Moving on to number 3, environmental factors. Environmental factors can contribute to the development of borderline personality disorder by impacting a person's emotional and psychological development and shaping, our understanding of ourselves and the world around us. Moving on to number 4, psychological factors. In terms of these, there are several factors that can contribute to the development of BPD. People with other mental health conditions such as depression or anxiety are more likely to develop it. Also, things like emotion regulation difficulties or low impulse control or negative beliefs about self or relationships have all been identified as risk factors for BPD. And these kinds of psychological factors could be linked to childhood trauma, which might be why some people end up feeling that their childhood caused their BPD and why I get so many questions about it. Now let's dig into childhood trauma a little bit more. Research has shown that individuals with BPD are more likely to have experienced childhood trauma, particularly emotional and sexual abuse, comparing to those without the disorder. Now, childhood trauma can cause disruptions in the development of the brain's emotion regulation system, like we said, which can lead to difficulties in managing intense emotions. We can be impulsive, have interpersonal issues, many of the symptoms associated with BPD. Additionally, childhood trauma can lead to difficulties in forming healthy attachments and relationships, which could contribute to the unstable and intense interpersonal relationships that we often see when we struggle with BPD. And childhood trauma can also affect a person's sense of self, leading to feelings of shame, guilt, blame, worthlessness, embarrassment, right? We've talked about that when it comes to trauma, and those are all common among people with BPD. And trauma can also lead to a lack of trust in oneself, in others, and in the world. I mean, if the people who are supposed to care for us harmed us, it's going to be hard for us to feel safe, right? And it can also erode our own ability to cope with our difficult emotions or difficult situations, which can make us feel bad about ourselves. And it's also important to note that not everyone who experiences childhood trauma will develop BPD, but it is a significant risk factor for the disorder. Overall, it makes sense to want to understand the causes of BPD, and it seems to be true that childhood experiences definitely play a role in the development of it. It is important to understand the impact that our experiences have on our mental health, and at the same time, blaming childhood experiences for BPD can lead to feelings of guilt and shame and create a sense of helplessness and lack of agency, which makes it harder for us to take responsibility for our recovery and to actively work on our mental health. Sometimes fixation on the past can keep us feeling totally powerless For some of us, it might be time to shift focus to the present or the future, knowing that BPD is not a personal failure. It's not a sign of brokenness, but a disorder that can be treated. With the right support, individuals with BPD can learn to manage their symptoms, just like any other mental illness. We can have healthy relationships and lead fulfilling lives. It's important to focus on working with a mental health professional and developing a treatment plan that addresses your specific needs and goals. We may not be able to control the circumstances that contributed to this moment, but we can control how we're going to handle them. Therapy, medication, and self-care practices can help you learn how to manage your symptoms and improve your overall well-being. Please leave any other thoughts that you have in those comments down below. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next time.